Do you know that there is a publishing company that wants to make life easier for you as a writer? This publishing company is called World Inkers Printing and Publishing. We publish in all different languages, and we're looking for writers of all genres, all formats. We're looking for scholars, ghostwriters, playwrights, poets, short fiction, novelists, you name it. We're looking for anybody who is interested in writing and the craft of writing to be in touch with us. You can reach us at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. With World Inkers Printing and Publishing, you do not require a lot of money to publish with us. Contact us today at info.worldinkers@gmail.com. Become a winner with other authors at World Inkers Printing and Publishing. Give us a shot. We will surely finish you. Welcome to Parrot TV's The Foreign Policy Review. I am Pickering, and today we have our usual suspect crew, CARLO, PARCELLI, and Billy Bob, to discuss the class struggle and the historical ramifications of such. And we also have a special guest, Jacques PAUWELS. So if he would like to tell us a little bit about himself, to give us an introduction for our guests and viewers.
Well, thank you. Yes, my name is Jacques PAUWELS. Jacques, French, but call me Jack if you want. That's what they call me here in Canada, where I've lived for about 50 years now, but I'm originally from Belgium. I came over when I was a young kid after my undergraduate studies over there in history. I'm a historian. I'm fascinated by history, love history, eat history, breathe history, drink history. You know, I'm a fanatic in history. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Ghent in Belgium, then came to Canada and did graduate studies, including a PhD in history. And then I loved being a student, so I continued, got a master's in political science. And then I got a PhD in political science as well. So eventually I had to do some serious work, and I ended up teaching at a number of universities here in the province of Ontario. I live near Toronto in Ontario. And I focused my studies primarily on 20th century history. My PhD was in German history, Nazi Germany. And that, of course, then that led me to the history of the First and Second World Wars, and on fascism and communism and the Russian Revolution. And these are the topics that are closest, dearest to my heart, and about which I have ended up writing a number of books. I never became a career professor at the university because I had other interests as well. I liked teaching and for a long time I did, teaching courses. Loved to be in touch with students. Learned a lot by teaching myself, probably more than my students. And but I stopped teaching about 20 years ago, and then I found time to write books. And I've ended up writing about 10 books so far, one of which is The Myth of the Good War, which deals with the role of the United States in the Second World War, much misunderstood, as you may know, but still the traditional image still being perpetuated by Hollywood and by TV documentaries and so on. You know? So I try to give an alternative, a more accurate view of how and why the United States became involved in World War II. And then I wrote also a book called Big Business and Hitler, how many major banks and corporations in the United States, but also in Britain and also in other countries, collaborate with Nazi Germany and made a lot of money, basically, and making it possible for Hitler to militarize Germany, to wage war, to win victories, to commit all kinds of crimes, and a lot of money was made in the process. And that's a very painful topic, but it's a very real one, and it's one that actually these corporations that were involved, like Ford and General Motors and IBM and ITT, they acknowledge that it's true. But of course, they are influential and powerful and make sure that none of this basically is brought to you by the media, you know, by the mainstream media. So you'll rarely ever hear any echoes of that on TV or in your newspapers. So I've written a few books about that, and they've been quite successful. One of my books has been translated into 9 languages, so I'm doing fairly well. I've also written a book about the First World War, and basically the background of the First World War. And there I have to tell you that the title is called The Great Class War. And that gives you a bit of an idea of what kind of my approach is. I use what social scientists call a class analysis approach, which is a polite word for saying it's Marxist, you know. So it's a Marxist approach, all right. And somewhere, I think Wikipedia saw fit to write something about me in not in English, but in the French, in the French edition of Wikipedia, because I've published books, quite a few books in France, and they call me a Marxist-Leninist historian, and that may be scary for some people. But actually, I thought of that, and I said, yeah, I guess you could say that, and that will lead me. I make this remark because I was asked to talk a bit about the class dimension of some of the recent developments in Ukraine and so on. And it is indeed my conviction that to understand history, to begin to understand history, and without understanding history, you can't begin to understand the present. That's another issue. Without a class analysis, without understanding that, as Marx pointed out, that class conflict is the dynamo of historical development. If you don't understand that, you will not understand what happened, for example, in the First World War, the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler, the Second World War, the Cold War. You can't begin to understand it. And not only do we need Marx's help then, who developed the idea of class struggle and how that can enlighten us and make us understand what is otherwise sort of mysterious, we also need to know, and this is very important, Lenin's concept of imperialism. And that is, again, a big word that scares away people, or else it's sort of understood as meaning, well, empires, the Roman Empire, yeah, sure. But I mean imperialism in the modern sense of the word, meaning capitalism in its worldwide manifestation. Capitalism at work, not only in one country, but worldwide. And that activity, that worldwide activity, is basically the work of the major capitalist players, countries, the United States, and others, fellow capitalist, imperialist countries like Canada, like Britain, like France, like Germany, and so forth. So we have to understand, to understand history, we have to call on these two tools for historical research and understanding. One is Marx's idea of class struggle, and the second one is Lenin's idea of imperialism. So that is the kinds of things that interest me, and that is the kinds of ideas that have inspired my books, and that's basically what I'm doing. And I have a new book coming out now very shortly. It's called The Great Myths of Modern History. It deals with the French Revolution, for example. It deals with the First World War. It deals with the Second World War, and indeed explains these very important historical phenomena, developments in those terms, in terms of class analysis and class struggle and of imperialism. So yeah, so that's really what I've been all about as an historian. That's what my interests are, and that's the kinds of research, the kinds of writings that I do.
I believe Billy Bob wanted to lead off with an initial question here.
I definitely do. So Jack, I'll use the English pronunciation. Jack, thank you so much.
Jack is fine. Jacques is sort of awkward in English, so everybody here calls me Jack. When I go to France, they call me Jacques.
Okay.
Actually, some of my French friends like to call me Jack because it's more sophisticated. They find over there to use a French word,
But yeah, our show has been tremendously blessed with some great guests, and today is no exception. I'm very, very thankful that you agreed to come on. Your expertise is tremendous, and it's been a big influence in my understanding of current events and history, etc. So, but you point out that it's the class struggle. It's it's the primacy, the overwhelming influence that the class struggle has had on history, which is really not appreciated very much at all, due to for many reasons. But I just want to get into your take on how important the class struggle was to the major events and what we're missing, and then kind of use that as a lens with which to see modern events. Yeah. That was what I was hoping you could share with us today. I don't know if CARLO had anything to add to that before we let you take it away.
No, I have follow-up questions.
Okay. But I just love hearing you talk, Jack. So okay. Please, whatever you think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me take it. I have to go back in time a bit. We'll get eventually to the war in Ukraine, but it'll take me a while. I have to make a detour in time to talk again about those two concepts. So Marx's idea of class struggle is very important to begin to understand history. But we have to understand that Marx analyzed capitalism in the middle of the 19th century. And capitalism has evolved over time. So Marx was right in pointing out the contradictions of capitalism and how it would force basically the proletariat, the working class, to react against being abused, being exploited, being oppressed, and therefore basically make a revolution. And that made a lot of sense, and Marx was admired, and he continues to be admired for these great insights. But the problem is that Marx died in 1880 something, and just at that time, capitalism was undergoing a metamorphosis in a big way. And what happened was essentially it's the advent of major players, major actors on the economic and social scene. And these are the big banks and big corporations. Call it big business, as opposed to the mom and pop kind of private enterprise, little business. So what you had is the emergence of major corporations that needed more than the savings of a family to operate. They needed the banks to collect millions of dollars to operate on a big scale and operate beyond the borders of your own country. So it's the advent of what some Marxist scholars have called monopoly capitalism. That is actually that transformed capitalism and made, so to speak, made it necessary for someone to update the Marxist analysis of the development of capitalism. And that is what Lenin would do. And Lenin, and I would recommend anybody to read that little book of his, you can call it a pamphlet if you want. He wrote it in 1916 during the First World War when he was in exile in Switzerland. And it's called Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, meaning that he realized that things have changed and that therefore Marx's views had to be not transformed, not changed, not rejected, no, adjusted to the new reality. And what Lenin then pointed out was that the arrival on the historical scene of big corporations and big banks forced basically, or made it possible, but also made it necessary for capitalism to move over the entire world, to expand worldwide. Because essentially these big corporations found their country where they were based too small. They needed more elbow room, so to speak. They needed to get their resources from far away. They needed to sell their products not only in their own country, they needed a bigger market. They needed to sell beyond their borders, to generate profits, even greater profits. And then these great profits, you had to invest more money into productive facilities elsewhere. And that meant that there was pressure on the governments by these banks and corporations. They pretty well owned the governments then, as they do now, as you may know, right? To force these governments to get a hold, to take control over territories that had what they wanted and needed, namely raw materials. Raw materials such as, for example, copper and all kinds of metals. But in the context of the late 19th century, the raw material that was most sought after in view of the advent of the automobile was petroleum and rubber. Now, for example, the automobile industry started in countries like the United States and France. Well, these countries, the United States had petroleum. France had no petroleum, and they had no rubber. The United States had no rubber. And that means that you had to find the rubber, buy it, or better still, control territories where it was to be found. You can get it yourself at cheap prices. So that's what. This whole advent of monopoly capitalism triggered this expansion worldwide, the conquest of colonies, right? And that's indeed when there was, for example, a scramble for Africa, because Africa, a huge continent, was blessed, or you might say, doomed, as having all these kind of wonderful resources, these wonderful raw materials that the capitalist core countries needed and wanted, but wanted to get as cheaply as possible. Therefore, they took over Africa. Because Africa, unfortunately, did not have strong states like Europe and some strong states in Asia, but it was easy for European Western armies to conquer and take over, and then basically exploit, oppress the local population at will. And that's how Africa was divided. European countries got themselves colonies. Other countries conquered lands nearby. In the late 19th century, the United States kept conquering the entire of North America from coast to coast, and then moved beyond that, to the Pacific, all the way to the Philippines, as you know, thanks to a splendid little war against Spain, also into the Caribbean. My country, little Belgium, grabbed the Congo, a huge piece of Africa, which, yes, the possession of the Congo is what made Belgium a rich country. Similarly, other countries like also got parts of Africa. France got much of North Africa, conquered Algeria, Tunisia, Senegal, you name it, right? And that's where these countries found what they wanted. And for example, I mentioned the automobile. The automobile, that's big business. You can't have a mom and pop operation, produce automobiles and sell automobiles. You need big corporations, financed by big banks, right? And then get their products as cheaply as possible all over the world and sell all over the world. And for example, in France, the automobile industry was lucky that France had turned Vietnam into a colony. And it's thanks to Vietnam that, for example, the Michelin man became so fat, because it's the rubber of Vietnam that was basically produced by very cheap slave labor, in fact, that made the French automobile industry competitive. That was not a problem. Not only did you have to conquer faraway lands and in competition with other countries, but then, of course, establish rivalries for markets, because you wanted these countries also, by the way, to then export your products to sell your whatever you produced, and to invest the extra money now you were making to invest into new productive facilities. So you can see how the economy changed quite a bit, and how this whole expansion, this transformation of capitalism into a worldwide phenomenon that became imperialism, because the national economies basically, competing with each other, they create and conquering colonies created what you could call, empires, formal or informal. The British Empire was a formal empire. The French Empire was more or less formal. The American Empire was always an informal empire. Nobody called it an empire. The United States didn't call its colonies. They gave it fancy names like Commonwealth or something. But I mean, they didn't, or they integrated, like Hawaii was conquered and integrated into the mother country. So this is what our friend Lenin was observing, and he was pointing out that this was actually at serious consequences. First of all, this expansion worldwide increased the rivalries between different countries, between different what they call national economies, like the German national economy with its big banks and big corporations, the French national economy with its big banks and corporations, the British, the American, you name it. It got involved more and more competition, rivalry, friction, hostility. And as Lenin wrote in 1916, that's what led to the First World War. But on the other hand, what you also have happened is that imperialism, as it was functioning then, generated huge profits for the banks and the corporations in the metropoles, in the mother countries, right? And a little bit of that money, a little bit of that was actually used to appease the working class in the metropoles. And what you have to keep in mind now is that because of the influence of Marxism and Marxist socialism in the late 1800s, a lot of socialist parties were springing up all over Europe, and trade unions making demands on behalf of the formerly very poor, impoverished, and oppressed working class, and threatened revolution. Now, with the super profits generated by the super exploitation of the colonies, the elites, the capitalist elites in these core countries of imperialism could actually make certain concessions to the working class in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and so on. Right? And that then meant that these socialist parties, this working class, ceased to be revolutionary. So to accept, the system as being not so bad, not so bad, and made them actually kind of grateful to their country for providing these benefits, which explains when in 1914 the war broke out, they rallied behind the flag to defend the dear fatherland that had been pretty good to them, Now, that is another issue. The other side of that coin was that the exploitation and the misery that had been typical for the situation of the working class in Europe in the 19th century and the United States was exported, so to speak, to the third world, to the colonies, to what we would later call the third world, and now would call increasingly the global south, right? So actually, you might say that because of imperialism, the lives of ordinary people, like my grandfathers and grandparents in Belgium, improved considerably at the end, starting at the end of the 19th century. They got to eat even meat 2 or 3 times a week. Imagine that, and drink lots of beer and stuff like that, right? So their lives improved, but it was at the expense of the black people in the Congo. Similarly, in our neighboring country in Holland, the standard of living of ordinary people rose, but it was at the expense of people in their colony in Indonesia. In France, the standard of living rose at the expense of people in North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, and all the other African colonies. So that was one of the problems. But what we have then is what the situation as described by Lenin is that out of all this, there emerges a kind of a hierarchy of countries. And it's a hierarchy which includes classes of countries. And here I want to refer to a wonderful author called Domenico Losurdo. He is an Italian, he died some years ago, unfortunately, way too young. He was an Italian philosopher and historian. And he wrote a wonderful book. I don't think it's available in English yet. Hopefully it will be someday, on class conflict. I learned an awful lot from Losurdo in many ways, but that book is also very, very important. And he points out that contrary to conventional belief, class conflict is not just between capitalists and workers. He says it's between many classes. It's not only between, for example, the capitalists, the industrialists and bankers and the working class. It's also a conflict that raged big time in the 19th century in Europe between the capitalists, the industrialists and the bankers on the one hand, and the large landowners, usually the nobility and the church on the other hand, right? And it's also a conflict within classes. For example, the bourgeoisie, there's a big difference between the upper bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, as we call it in English, and the lower middle class, the petite bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. You can't compare the members of the upper middle class, who are often very, very wealthy, with the petty bourgeoisie, which are independent, operators who may own a shop or something like that, or artisans, or who produce something. They think they're capitalists, but they're not really capitalists, but they're independent. They're not wage earners. Okay, they have to work themselves to generate an income. So there's that difference is also very, very important. And one of the big illusions today is that people who are in the petty bourgeoisie think they are bourgeois, middle class. In a sense, they are not. They're very much part of the working class, so to speak, but they have to generate their own income as opposed to relying on a salary, on a wage. So what you have is that Losurdo explained how class conflict is not only a matter between just an upper class and a lower class, a bourgeoisie and a working class. It's between different classes. It's conflict within classes. And it's also conflict between countries. And now we're getting back to the situation that arises as a result of the imperialism as analyzed by Lenin. What you have now is actually a pyramid of countries, with some countries forming an upper class on top and some countries forming a lower class, a proletariat of countries at the bottom. The have countries at the top, the owning countries, and the have not countries at the bottom, right? So we have on the very top, the very wealthy countries. Wealthy in the sense that the wealthy people live there, not in the sense that everybody's wealthy. That's not a fad illusion that a rich country, all people are rich in a rich country. No, it's the other way around, actually. In a rich country, some people are very rich and quite a few people are very poor. That's true for the United States. That's true for Canada, and it's true for other countries that are rich. Yes, the average wealth is very high, but the 1 or 2%, as we call it, own most of the wealth and the others do not. Having said that, let's go back to the idea of Losurdo and class struggle within countries, because that's going to be important. We're going to have to think about that when we talk about what's going on in Russia today. So you have countries that are very privileged, that are the elite, that are the bourgeoisie, the upper class of countries, right? Like today, the Western world, we call it today. That's a euphemism, because the Western world includes Japan, that's not in the West, right? It includes Australia, that's in the deep South. You know what I mean? It's just a way to obfuscate the reality that we are the owning countries, countries that appropriated most of the wealth in the course of history and want to keep it for themselves and increase it year by year. And then you have the proletarian countries at the bottom, mostly in Africa, Latin America, and you name it, right? And these are the countries that don't have, even though they may be rich countries. Africa is a very rich continent, but the people are very poor. Excuse me. Sorry, damn telephones. Africa is a very rich country. The people are very poor, right? So what you have then is the rich countries on top, and then the have-not countries, the proletarian countries at the bottom, the colonies, the ex-colonies. And that could be, by the way, some big countries too, because in the context of the interwar period after First World War, for example, on the bottom of the countries was one of the biggest countries in the world, namely China. And China had never been colonized as such, but it was a semi-colony. I mean, bits and pieces of China had been colonized. You know, every major country had enclaves in Shanghai and everywhere else. Hong Kong is an example, you know what I mean? Macau was owned by Portugal. You know, there were these mini colonies, these concessions. And they were scrambling to get control over China because China seemed to be the big prize. And China was a big country, but very weak. So it was open to conquest, right? So China was at the bottom, was also a have-not. You might say a poor country, in many ways a proletarian country, no matter how big it was. Same thing can be said about the Ottoman Empire, you know, which would indeed also fall prey to the big ones on top. Because as with people, the countries in the upper class are very rich compared to the countries at the bottom that have nothing. But you know what? They don't want to keep it that way. They want to be richer next year. And much of the extra wealth they intend to generate year after year has to come from greater and greater exploitation of the ones at the bottom, right? I mean, that is something that in the Western world, we don't want to know, right? We don't want to know. We like to blame the poverty of Africa on the fact that these people are, oh my God, you know, underdeveloped. That's a euphemism, you know. Maybe not as smart as we are, you know. When I was a kid in Belgium, we were told that we ruled the Congo because we were bright, smart, hardworking, you know. That was us, right? And these poor people, those poor black people in Africa, well, you know, I know it's too bad. They're very poor, but you know what? That's the way it is over there, you know. They're not very smart, you know. They're a bit lazy. You know, the benefits of imperialism for ordinary people in the mother countries also brought about racism, okay? Today, it's an illusion to think that racism is in the mind, and if we change our mind, racism will go away. Bullshit. You know, racism is actually the product of the material conditions in the world today, whereby the people of color tend to be the poor ones, and white people the rich ones. But the ones that are rich cannot possibly convince themselves that they are rich because they've exploited the poor down below. No, they got to rationalize it and say, well, we are rich because we're smart, you know, because we worked hard, you know what I mean? And those people, they're a bit lazy, you know, let's face it. And they didn't have the brains to develop the way we did, you know what I mean? Hopefully, someday they'll get wise just like us. So they'll have to learn from us, and then someday all will be well there too. But in the meantime, it's just too bad, so sad, you know, but that's just the way it is. So that is really then the way that we have a pyramid of countries, and it's basically different levels, different classes of countries, okay? And today we have on top the Western world, that's the capitalists. They're the exploited countries, the oppressing countries. At the bottom, you have the exploited, the oppressed countries. No longer colonies, but neo-colonies, you know, as dependent of the countries on top as before, as exploited as before, arguably even more so by the countries on top. I mean, most people don't realize that, but we are all asked to give money to get to the third world or all that stuff and support good causes. And we have philanthropists, millionaires who do wonderful things and fly the private jet to Namibia to, you know, make a visit to a village and pat the little children on the head and all that stuff, all that bullshit, right? But you know that every year, much of the wealth, even today, is transferred every year from the global south to the global north. Every year today, because of the mechanisms of our rules-based order, the rules that we make up, we still basically take the wealth of the South take it to the north. We are still, so it's as with in capitalism in general, ladies and gentlemen, I'm starting to say that. That's the way it works, Much of the profits come from exploiting the poor, essentially. That's why it takes a lot of poor people to make few people very rich. That's a rule. It's interesting how you go to the poorest countries, have the richest people. Not many, but you go to India, for example. I've been to India a few times. Millions of people are very, very poor, but some are filthy rich, filthy rich. The United States is a good example of that too. Canada to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of poverty in the United States. What's the percentage now of the population in the United States living below the official poverty line? Like 20% or something like that? That's millions of people, right? But then there's some people who are filthy rich. And people in the third world, when they watch Hollywood movies, they think everybody lives in a villa in Malibu and drives a big fancy Cadillac and has a wonderful blonde girlfriend with blonde hair and big boobs and all that stuff. That's the crap they fell for in Eastern Europe, before the Berlin Wall came down, right? They believe that all going to lead lives like that, right? They thought they were going to be. That's what was awaiting them, was like living like that in an apartment in Manhattan overlooking Central Park, a villa in Malibu, stuff like that, right? That was propaganda, but of course we don't do propaganda. The other guys do propaganda. We speak the truth, of course, that. But anyway, so back to my point then. My point.
Can we take our half-hour break?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We're going to take a brief break. We'll come back with some questions.
I want to make a point though that
go ahead.
Class relations also define relations between countries, and class conflict also rages between countries, among countries. Okay.
Absolutely. So let's take a brief break. We'll be right back.
All right.
Are you curious about financial literacy? Then take a look at Professor Anthony Rivecchio's new program on Parrot TV. It's called Financial Focus University. This is an excellent program to learn about questions related to your own finances post-COVID, and how you can manage your money, how you can work with your tax situation. And this is an excellent and informative discussion of financial literacy. With Professor Anthony Rivecchio, your financial problems will be solved at Parrot TV with Financial Focus University. Hey, sports fans! New York Parrot has come out with a great new show for you guys, Sports with Rich. Broadcast time 10 p.m. Tuesday evening. Rich Mancuso with Robert Rizzo as a co-host. Sports with Rich is captivating, informative, and entertaining, and it will pertain to all American sports such as soccer, football, basketball, baseball, athletics, wrestling, you name it. Get rich information from Rich Mancuso on Sports with Rich. Parrot TV, the voice for humanity. Welcome back to the Foreign Policy Review. We're discussing imperialism, class struggle, and how that's relating to the current crises in the world. So let's further ask if we have any more questions. Carlo or Billy Bob, do you guys have any questions for Jacques?
I'd like to hear Jacques just finish his thought that he broke off before the commercial break.
And it seems clear that we're going to have Jack back next week too, because there's a lot to say. But please continue.
Well, next week I'm off to Europe again on Wednesday, so it has to be fast. But I'll be happy to come back. There's a lot to talk about, and it's true that once I get going, it's sometimes not easy to stop me because there's so much important stuff that needs to be said.
I have a question. Like how does culture relate to imperialism?
How does culture relate to imperialism?
Right. How does it reflect imperialism, and how is it used as an imperialist tool?
Well, I have not really wrapped my mind around that issue very much. I'm not saying it's of no interest, of no importance. It is, but I mean, for example, today, imperialism is mostly English speaking. It's Anglo, and it's mostly American Anglo, right? So I mean, the imperialist control over the entire world, the attempt to control the entire world. Today, there's resistance. That's one of the issues we should talk about. It has been ever since 1945, and I can tell you why since 1945, has been accompanied by an Americanization, right? I mean, here in Canada, I mean, most people, my friends in Europe, think Canada is part of the United States. I mean, we look American, they think we're American. You know, I got a letter once, Jacques Powell, Brantford, Ontario, Canada, USA. You know, people don't know the difference, right? I go to England and they think I'm American. You know, I go to the United States, they think I'm English. But because we speak here in Canada. But I'm just saying, Americanization is a tool of imperialism in a way, you know, or a reflection of it. And I'm not saying it's done consciously, no. But I mean, I love France, and I travel a lot in France and Italy. I just came back from Italy. They're all eating hamburgers, the young kids now. They're all going to McDonald's. They all want to watch TV while they're eating. I mean, one of the pleasures that I still enjoy a lot, I'm a little bourgeois in that respect, you know, very bourgeois actually. I love to go to a restaurant in France or Italy and sit down for a nice meal, you know, and eat the specialties of France and all that. And, you know, I don't need the TV around me, you know, and I want to eat something French. I want to eat brains or something like that, you know, or calf liver or things I can't get at home. But the young kids in France, they don't want to go there anymore. These restaurants are closing down. They're at McDonald's. They're eating hamburgers, French fries, and they want to sit at a bar where a sports bar where they can watch soccer or the sports on TV and ogle the girls at the bar while they're chewing on a pizza, you know. So in a way, that is the part of the Americanization, and it's not only that; it's much more than that, you know. It's much more than that. But that also is good for business, American style business. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously, McDonald's is a good example of that. McDonald's must be making zillions of dollars just selling hamburgers now, you know, in lands like Italy and France, where they had so much good food that they needed the hamburgers like a hole in the head, essentially. And it's bad for their health. Obesity is going there too now. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, but the owners of and the bankers and the sponsors of McDonald's are laughing all the way to the bank. So that's how I would say that's an crude, but I think relevant way in which culture is related to imperialism, don't you think? And it's the same with movies. Hollywood is a major exporter of American culture, and Hollywood is in the business. I mean, Hollywood is sponsored by the CIA, by the Pentagon. I mean, the message. I stay away from Hollywood most of the time, but occasionally I see a movie and I say, "Oh my God, this is so bad that it's probably going to get an Oscar." You know. I remember movies being so bad, like I remember movies that I said it's going to win the Oscar. It's so bad, right? And sure enough, it won the Oscar, right? I mean, I remember some movie. God, what was it? I love to forget the names of these movies, but anyways, there's some examples of that. So Hollywood is in the business of backing up, you know, or supporting the system that I'm describing, the worldwide imperialist system. And this worldwide imperialist system then is based on this hierarchy of countries, of which the hegemon is the United States, with as lieutenants, you know, Britain, you know, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, Japan. You know, this is the West, right? And then the little guys, you know, the petit bourgeoisie of countries like Belgium, Holland, you know, Portugal, Spain, Italy. You know, Italy, you know what I mean? This is us, right? This is the cream of the crop, so to speak, the Western world, you know, and that's where the culture is being homogenized. It's being much of the same, you know, and that's part of the system now. So yeah, that's so much about culture.
Yeah, I do have a question that I'll first of all, I want to mention that I was interested when you mentioned rubber, because the Germans went to extraordinary lengths to try to synthesize rubber, and the whole books have been written on that.
Auschwitz was next. They would build a plant to make rubber right next to Auschwitz.
Right.
They were so desperate to have rubber. Yes.
Yeah. So
the Buna works.
Yeah. So
financed by the Deutsche Bank and by IG Farben, which is Bayer. Yes.
IG Farben, especially. Yes. Yes.
But that's Bayer today.
Yes. Right. Yeah. They just changed their name. Which also, let's see, what do I have here? We had to talk about the different class structure among countries. We had Christopher Black on for three episodes, and he spoke very eloquently about he has a tremendous experience with the ICC and defending the African elites Rwanda.
Rwanda, yes.
Yeah. So, and obviously the ICC is even class oriented because you're much more likely to end up in front of the ICC if you're from Africa
Right.
or
Yes.
from the South. So
Yes.
that's interesting. The other, and so I guess what I wanted to ask is now with this Ukrainian situation and this notion of Nazis, we have, oddly enough, I mean, I'm so shocked by it sometimes, this attempt to lift the onus away from the Nazis, to lift this vile, just vile um, ideology to among American statesmen, among European statesmen, to lift the onus that's existed ever since I was a child. All my uncles went to World War II. They fought the Nazis, but anecdotally, my wife can attest to this. I had uncles that would say things like, "I think the Nazis were right," because of American civil rights, because African Americans were gaining rights in this country using that notion. And I think that element has reappeared in corporate media and in European and American culture. And if you would, I'd like you to comment on that if you sense that too.
Well, yes, I can say I'll comment on that right away. Nazism is the German variety of fascism. Okay, let's get that straight. So, Nazism is not a phenomenon that by itself. It's not a singularity. It's part of the movement of fascism that arose after the First World War, right?
Right.
And it's essentially a very anti-democratic response to the Russian Revolution. And because the Russian Revolution scared the elites everywhere, and the capitalist elites, and they were searching for ways to basically to prevent similar revolutions at home, and a way to undo that revolution in that god-awful country. What's it called? The Soviet Union, right? The cradle, the wellspring of revolutions that could bring basically the revolution to our own country. So there was a need to repress communism, the revolutionary movement, at home, and wipe out communism abroad in the Soviet Union, right? And who's going to do it? How are we going to do it? Well, the example was set in Italy by Mussolini, who basically, with the support of the elites, basically started basically militias, similar to the Ku Klux Klan in the States, essentially, which was a similar militia, right? To beat up, murder, and basically to get rid of the commies, right? And with major support of the powers that be, including the army, the Vatican, Italy, and all of that under the cover of a seemingly popular, hence populism movement, not democratic, populist. Populist is not democratic. Democratic is something that's by and for the people, and populism is actually pretending to be for the people. Hitler was a populist. Mussolini was a populist, but they were both anti-democratic. But the fascism, the advantage that fascism had, and from the perspective of the ruling classes, and for the purpose of basically repressing the urge for more democracy and the threat of a revolution which might bring democracy about, for the purpose of that, it was better to use fascism as a system because it seemed to be something for the people. Hitler himself called his party socialist. It wasn't socialist. He called it a workers' party. It wasn't a workers' party. But that's how you could sell the product. And actually, I write that in my next book that's coming up now. All over Europe at that time, the elites wanted to repress democracy and avoid revolution. And there was two ways of doing it. One was the old-fashioned way, bring in a military dictator, okay? Mannerheim in Finland, Pilsudski in Poland, Franco in France, in Spain, right? But that was so patently, obviously anti-democratic, and smacked so much of the despised old systems, which most people despised, that these regimes were not seen to be the best solution. But fascist regimes did exactly the same thing, even worse in terms of repression, but pretended to be rising from the people. Hitler, a little guy from the people, presumably, who calls for a socialist, revolutionary, anti-capitalist, bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. But it worked, right? Similarly with fascism elsewhere, Mussolini pretended also to be a little guy from the people who was going to work on behalf of the people. But he was basically just simply a puppet, of the big banks, the big corporations, the Vatican, the monarchy, and you name it, right? So in that respect, fascism in general and Nazism in particular was very useful. And indeed, wherever fascists come to power, the first thing they do is eliminate the communist parties and the other socialists and close down the trade unions, right? And it's done. So that was one thing. So fascism was useful for the purpose of repressing democracy and the danger of revolution, a la Russian style, at home. And then fascism could also be used, it seemed, to get rid of communism in its own lair in the Soviet Union. And that was the big dream of the elites in Europe, right, starting at the time of the revolution itself, which when the First World War wasn't even over yet. And we, the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Belgium, all sent troops during the revolution to help the white counter-revolution, despicable Tsarist system against the nasty Reds, right? And you know what? Darn it, it didn't work. And it didn't work for two reasons. Because first of all, the people over there didn't want the whites. They supported the Reds. And even the people, the working class in England, for example, refused to load ships that were sending troops to Murmansk and Odessa and so on, because they sympathized with the Reds in Russia. So we had to withdraw our troops reluctantly. So the United States Army, British Army, we had to withdraw from Russia. And darn it, wouldn't you know, the damn Reds won. But someday we're going to get them. So the question was, who's going to do it? Well, then Hitler said, I'll do it. And that was fantastic, because that actually was a double whammy. First of all, if he does it, we don't have to do it. And Germany is a mighty country. I'm sure he can do it, especially if he rearms. He's not supposed to because of the Versailles Treaty, but it's okay. We'll let him get away with it. And rearming Germany, that's all the cost of the money. He needs planes and tanks. He doesn't have the money for that. Not to worry, we'll raise the money. Our banks, the Bush family, Prescott Bush raised money in the United States to basically finance Hitler's rearmament of Germany. You know that, right?
Yes.
Yes, you know that, right? And so did the Bank of England and all that stuff. They were all happy to loan money, right? But Germany didn't have any money. How is he going to pay it back, Mr. Hitler? War of conquest. Which country are going to conquer? Luxembourg, Belgium? No. The Soviet Union. Wonderful. So we make money arming Hitler to the teeth and loaning him the money to buy from us, to buy oil, because these vehicles need oil. Standard Oil in New Jersey, Rockefeller sold them the oil at high prices. So Hitler essentially borrowed money from American banks, Union Bank of New York, for example, to buy American products like oil and other weapons, right, and know-how. And American companies were producing in Germany, like Ford and General Motors for him, right, making plenty of money in the process. And all of that to wage a war against the Soviet Union, which was going to raise the loot that would enable him to pay back the loans. Wonderful system. And we were off the hook, because for once the Germans were going to march east. And if they march east, they don't march west. So if they attack the Ruskies, we don't give a shit. They'll leave the Belgians, the Dutch, the French alone, right? So isn't that a wonderful arrangement? That's what we were looking for. That was the big hope in 1938, 39. It didn't quite work out that way, but that was always the idea. And actually,
take a moment to acknowledge Franca Calusa, who just commented a minute ago. Just take a minute to acknowledge her. Thank you so much, Franca. Go ahead.
So this actually then the idea that a war of rapine, a war of conquest and looting in Russia, a country of unlimited possibilities, that would be a wonderful thing for business. That's still today. That is still the idea today. Today, the war in Ukraine is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between the United States and Russia. It's a war between the West and Russia. And it's not just a war about to defend democracy. That's bullshit. It's a war for regime change in Moscow, which will allow us to bring back a Yeltsin, who is our golden boy, who will open the doors wide for American banks and firms to walk in and take what they want. Help yourself, as long as you send, of course, commissions to our bank in Switzerland. We have nothing against these Russian oligarchs as long as they are our oligarchs. Okay, these oligarchs are thieves. Okay, they're what Yeltsin presided over was the greatest rape of a country in the history of mankind, because the wealth built up by the Soviet people at huge effort and sacrifices was basically privatized, meaning stolen. It was stolen, including by the Yeltsin family. I was in Russia not so long ago, and he's from what's the place in Siberia? I was there. There's a huge monument there to Yeltsin, blah blah blah, and his family owns most of the industries all around there, right? And similarly, the friends of Yeltsin grabbed what could be grabbed. These guys were thieves and murderers at the same time, and they caused a tremendous decline in the lifestyle and the standard of living of Russians. It was a catastrophe for ordinary Russians, but it was wonderful for Western business that could move in, and that's why we hate Putin, or we're supposed to hate him, because he put a stop to that nonsense. Yeah. He was raised to be the successor, the Prince of Wales to Yeltsin, and give us more of the same. And instead, Putin had the good sense. I don't admire Putin, but the good sense to stop the nonsense and really allow only those oligarchs, there's still oligarchs there, who are willing to invest more in Russia, and that enabled him to bring back a kind of a welfare state. Because I've been to Russia a number of times in recent years. People in Russia are much better off than they were in the 90s. The 90s was a catastrophe. In the 90s, under Yeltsin, Russia was worse than a third world country. And now, actually, the standard of living has gone up quite a bit. People in Russia, most of them support Putin. We don't hear about them. It doesn't fit our image. We hear about Navalny, for example. Navalny is supposed to be the opposition in Russia. He's a nobody. You never hear about the Communist Party being the serious opposition, having a good chance of winning elections. They don't want to talk about that. But I'm just saying, this is what happened then. The idea was that the wealth of Russia would be made available, and Russia would become a satellite, like Canada, of the number one country in that pyramid, that class structure of international capitalism or imperialism, if you want. And this is what you have. And the war, this war is also good. Not only is it a war that aims at exactly this, at replacing this obnoxious Putin with a new Yeltsin, that's opened the doors for Russia again, for our banks and McDonald's ought to move right in. Now they're moving out. Now whoever was still there has to move out, right? But it's also a way, wars are good for business in many ways, because of course, people that sell weapons, people that sell the mercenaries and so on, that's big business, as you may know. War has been partly privatized. There's a lot of mercenaries now fighting, in Ukraine, as you know, and the companies that provide these guys, this cannon fodder, cheap cannon fodder, they're making good money there too. But it's also a way for the United States, the hegemon of capitalism, to impose discipline on its restless, on the restless petty bourgeoisie, so to speak, of international militarism, international imperialism. And that's, for example, Germany. Okay, because Germany was flirting with Russia, as you may know. They were going to buy cheap gas from Russia.
Right. Nord Stream too.
And you know what? That, of course, when you do business together, you tend to warm up to each other, and play golf together. You know how it goes, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a danger from the United States perspective that Germany might find to be close ties with Russia for the benefit of both sides. But we get nothing out of that. By now Washington can force Germany to nix, to get rid of that system, that plan, to drop that plan for gas, and we'll sell you gas. Okay, we'll bring in by boat, we'll bring the gas and the oil. It's going to cost money because that's the market. You know what I mean? So the Germans are going to pay big bucks. Germans are getting screwed in the process because they're immensely stupid to go along with all these sanctions, which hurt them more than Russia. Russia is immune to most of these sanctions. I'm not saying they like it. They're immune to it. And the business that Europe is losing in the process is never, ever going to come back. Let me give you an example. As I mentioned, I'm from Belgium. And Belgium has an industry, there's quite a bit of business with Russia. especially the fruit industry. They used to sell like apples and fruit galore to Russia. A couple of years ago, they slapped sanctions on Russia. Russia said, fine, no more fruit from Belgium. Don't ever come back. Don't ever, ever, ever come back. Don't think that next year, no. Don't ever come back. We're buying our apples now in Pakistan and elsewhere. And this is something else I want to say. In this hierarchy of countries where the West is on top, with the United States as the hegemon of the West, right? And the colonies at the bottom, right? Say Africa, right? Africa, the colonies or ex-colonies. Today in Africa, African countries sympathize with Russia. We like to think, and our media like to tell us that the whole world hates Putin and is going rah, rah, rah for Ukraine. It's not true. It's not true. In Africa, they like the Russians to win. And you know why? Because the Russians have always supported movements against imperialism. The Soviets were great supporters of the independence of the colonies. Let me use strong language. Without Soviet support, countries like India and Indonesia and Vietnam would not have become independent. And over there, they know it.
Sure.
We hated the Soviet Union for supporting the independence fighters in our colonies. How dare they, right? But over there, they were grateful for the support they got from Moscow. And Moscow took students from Africa and trained them engineers and lawyers, and they had to pay zero to study university. We even given a room and board and everything else, right? They were very, very grateful. Africa today remembers. In Africa today, many African countries, even when officially aligned with the West, are actually very happy to deal with the Russians and sympathize with Russians.
When I was in Moscow, I was at Red Square, and a crowd had gathered as they did, and the crowds gathered every day to argue politics. And I saw this crowd, and in the middle of that crowd was a young African kid, college age probably, and he was from Burkina Faso. And the argument was very animated, and he was in there right with the Russians, and there was no sense of superiority. Everybody had a say. And that was. But what you just said, just kind of confirms my suspicion, and that is that imperialism is the root of fascism, and that fascism is a convenient tool of imperialism, and that's why now we're getting this notion that that we need the Nazis in Ukraine because they're doing our bidding, our will.
Yeah.
And they'll take it that far. The ethical and moral consequences of that and history of that are ignored. Yeah. And I think that's kind of sums up part of what you were saying. And
with that said, we have a remaining minute or so of the program, so we're going to go ahead and close, but we'll come back next week with a similar discussion. Everybody watching today, well, thanks for watching the Foreign Policy Review. Please subscribe to our channel, our YouTube, as we speak now. And if you're watching us on Facebook, go to our YouTube and subscribe to Parrot TV. We'd love to have you as a subscriber, leave your comments during the program as well. And remember, we also have the Literary Corner and the World Inkers Network to watch old episodes if you want to do that. So thanks for joining us, Jock, today. And Billy, Bob, and Carlo, thanks for your comments and questions. I hope everybody out there gets some reading done and have an excellent day. Foreign Policy Review. Thank you so much for watching.